Princes and Priests. Chapter 21, Unplanned Events. Dave was so tired that he didn't think he could continue fighting. Then, in the darkness, he spotted Ivan. Dave, having lost his horse hours ago, walked wearily toward his friend who had remained on foot. The battle was over for the most part. The storm still lingered, as did the heat, but the nomads were in control. They were chasing down the few survivors and cleaning up the wounded and dead, at least in this area. Several others of their company were already with Ivan, standing on the riverbank. Raven was cautiously looking over the low mud cliff they stood on to try to see up and down the river.
How far down are we?
Dave asked wearily as he reached them.
About 10 miles, I think,
Oirion said, wiping his brow.
Anyone see Kelly?
Dave asked.
No,
Ivan said.
and I have been looking for her. The battle's gotten vast, though. She could be anywhere. You hurt much?
Nothing too serious.
Dave drew a deep breath, seeing Shannon and Elliot walking toward them. Even in the smoke and gathering darkness, he could make them out by their stance and stride. He felt oddly chilled to see them walking stride for stride, in an obvious mirror of motion and form. At a glance, it would have been hard to tell who was who if his father had tamed his hair, which he never did.
Dave.
Elliot took his son in a great embrace when they reached the group. Dave returned it, glad that his father had lived through to the end.
We won?
Ivan asked.
Whoa!
Elliot said, looking at Kava.
Now aren't you a fantastic-looking fellow?
Kava grinned.
This is Carver.
Dave said.
Carver, this is my father, Elliot.
Kava nodded his head and put a hand to his chest.
Well met,
He said.
We won, right?
Ivan asked again.
Please tell me we won.
We won,
Shannon said, just as the bank gave way and dropped right under their feet. Shannon jumped back, able to grab hold of Elliot, but Dave, Oirion, Raven, Ivan, and Kaava went down. Shannon jerked Elliot further back from the bank as the soft earth collapsed. For the others, the drop to the river was a good 12 feet, and the cold of the water was shocking.
Get hold of each other.
Dave yelled as soon as he broke the surface, feeling the power in the water at once.
Don't lose each other in the current.
He gave a hard stroke sideways to reach Kava, who was obviously overweighted.
I can't swim.
Kava splashed and scrambled to grab the muddy bank. He almost got a grip, but the whole side gave way, and they were spun out in the current. Dave shouted at him to stop thrashing as he grabbed the Orcan man. He tried to cast ropes, but the magic utterly failed. Everything happened shockingly fast. Before Dave had a chance to look back to see if his father or Shannon were going to help them, they were already going around a bend toward the rapids that marked the end of the territory and the outer edge of the battlefield. He got a brief glimpse of Shannon running down the bank after them. They did their best to swim together and hold on. Raven was struggling to pull off his heavy furs as they quickly became waterlogged and started to pull him under. Oirion was there and grabbed Raven from behind, helping to keep him afloat as he shed his furs. Ivan was the unifying power that kept them all together and their heads above water. Without his great strength and swimming ability, they would not have made it for long. It wasn't a painful ride like Oirion had before, but the river was fast, deep, and painfully cold after the heat of the battle, and they were all exhausted to begin with. They couldn't seem to get close enough to the shore to even hope to grab anything along the banks, and they were getting farther and farther from where they were supposed to be. The cold was turning them blue and making their hands not work. It was getting darker the further they went, and the flashes of the storm's lightning were becoming distant, lost at times, hidden behind the banks and hills that rushed past them. They were swept past miles of prairie and into a forest before the river slowed enough for them to swim for the shore. Ivan finally got hold of the bank. By his sheer strength, he gripped the roots of an old fallen tree. Gasping and struggling to keep his own head up, he became a bridge to dry ground for the others. In the darkness, they were able to drag themselves out of the water, soaked and dripping. They were dangerously cold, and the black sky offered no sun to warm them. Ivan collapsed on the shore and curled up, overcome with hypothermia. They had no way to even find wood in the dark, and all were in shock. At Orion's teeth-chattering orders, they crawled to each other and huddled close against the cold. He did his best to summon up enough power to raise a tent spell over them in an effort to hold in what little heat they had left in their utterly drained bodies. Dawn brought the end of Orion's ability to hold up the tent, which forced them to rise and look around. They were in a wood that was made of aspen, cottonwoods, and birches, as well as other trees that they didn't recognize. Dave immediately went to gather wood. Raven moved to pick up a bit of driftwood but sat heavily on the ground and wiped his hair out of his face. He was worn out, body and soul, and could not seem to summon energy for even such a simple task.
This is for fun,
Kava said, his teeth chattering. He put his arm around Oirion to share warmth.
Yeah, it was.
Even said, almost like a wounded child.
I hate this place.
We're mostly still together.
Dave pointed out.
It could be worse. We could each be alone.
We lost all the women.
Even said.
Kelly, Salma, Tavia.
He bowed his head.
Miserable land.
Dave got a big fire going just as the sun rose, and they all stood as close to it as they could. It was all they could do to just stand there shivering, trying to dry their clothes as best as possible. It wasn't an easy thing to do, as snow had started to fall. Dave knelt and rubbed Orion's hands briskly, trying to keep the man from slipping too far away.
Maybe we should have stayed in Ulam Ar,
Ivan said.
No.
Dave said.
If we had, then all those nomads would be dead. Even if we die for that reason, we die for a worthy thing.
That's very noble thinking of you, Dave.
Ivan got out through his shivering. Dave wasn't as bad off as the others seemed to be, and suspected that he had his Pertan ancestry to thank for that. Even Kava seemed to be struggling to warm up and stay conscious. Once Oirion was steady enough, he raised another tent and pulled them into it. The heat started to soak in, and they all drifted safely to sleep. To say he was tired was an understatement. Theo was feeling every bit of his age and more. He had scrubbed the paint off his body, what was left of it, and found that it had burned him in places where the spells had been hit so hard that they had been broken. The heat of the energy released was enough to sear flesh. He had bruises that he could not begin to explain, and a migraine like he had not endured for decades. He just wanted to curl up and sleep for weeks.
Theo
Jerked up, nearly blacking out as light exploded in his head.
Shannon?
He asked, not sure he was seeing straight.
What?
get up, we have to go.
Go.
He almost cried at that.
Why?
The others just got washed down the river and we have to get them.
He rolled himself up to his knees and sat a moment, trying to stop the pounding in his head. He paused to get his balance before he reached for clothes. Shannon grabbed a hold of his face and lifted his chin. The Perton studied Theo a moment before he looked over his naked, bruised, and burned body.
I don't have any clothes.
Theo realized. Shannon grabbed off his cloak and draped it around Theo.
We need to hurry.
Right, yes, hurry, lead on.
If it mattered that much, Theo wasn't going to argue. He stumbled after Shannon in nothing but the boots he pulled on and the cloak. They cut through the camp and down to the river. The water was so cold that it hurt to touch it. Theo stumbled after Shannon to the bank, but what had once been a smooth ford was now a steep bank that sent Theo slipping down into the frigid water all at once. The water was nearly up to his waist and left him struggling to breathe and feel his feet. With each step, his feet felt like they were being slashed by razor knives. His body was begging for rest, but he kept going, one step at a time. On the far side, Shannon stopped and looked back at the man who was not quite halfway across. He turned back and went to Theo. Taking hold of his elbow, Shannon all but pulled him across, regardless of pain. Theo actually had tears on his cheek by the time they reached the other side. He didn't say anything, but just kept moving after Shannon. He was not focusing on the way they went or where they were going. He just followed as he had for months. Pain was certainly not a new thing to Theo. At least now he knew that Shannon was not going to rip his soul out, allowing him to concentrate on forcing his body to obey. When they stopped, Theo stood wavering for a moment while Shannon spoke to someone outside a tent. It seemed a long way to walk to get to another camp. The man opened the tent, allowing them to enter. Unlike the nomad tents, this one was made with vertical walls and rose up to a shallow peak, very like the ancient tents of Awans. It was well lit with a lamp hanging on a gold chain. It was also larger and smelled of food. Heat was almost painful to his body after the cold. He was aided to a bed and made to sit. He looked up at Shannon, trying to think and focus.
Sorry.
He apologized for being in pain, worn out, and too tired to think. Shannon smiled faintly.
You're doing fine. Just catch your breath.
Here.
Captain Elliot handed him a mug that was large, hot, and full of steaming drink. Theo took a sip quickly, afraid that his hands would drop the weight. It was warm and spread through him like nothing he had ever had before.
Not bad, huh?
The captain said with a grin.
This place does have its high points.
He straightened and switched languages from Owens to Norwin.
Are you sure about this?
Elliot asked Shannon. Shannon didn't say anything right away, taking his seat with the same grace with which he always moved.
Did you talk to the men?
I did. They are looking for whatever they can find. I don't know about this, Shannon. Jerome is a powerful force here, and he has allies among the elves, I guarantee it.
Elliot paused, his unhappiness for the situation showing on his face. He ran a hand through his hair in a motion of distress.
You could have just run down the bank and rescued them. I know that you have the ability. I have seen you do far more impressive things.
If I thought I could have, I would have done so.
I thought I lost him once. I'm not so ready to just let him go again.
Elliot said with a sigh, and then dropped into a chair and sat with his head in his hands.
If they get hold of him...
I'm well aware of the dangers,
Shannon said.
I will get him back.
Elliot looked up at the Purton.
I should not doubt that, but I am not much less worried for you. You choose not to go with warriors or wizards, but a boy so exhausted he can barely stand up? I do not understand your thinking.
Theo looked up from the mug to see what Shannon's reaction to that was going to be. Theo spoke Norwin just fine and wondered close to the same thing. Shannon sat as he normally would, calm and in control. He looked at the captain who sat across from him, as informal as Shannon was formal. His hair as wild as Shannon's was tamed, but the captain was still a Purton under the wild hair and pirate clothes. Shannon smiled faintly and focused his blue eyes to look at Theo.
Not all great warriors wear swords, Elliot.
Riddles, uncle. So he is a great sorcerer, yes? The nomads are rather impressed, but then ShaHaNon has them all but praising him as an avatar.
ShaHaNon has skill and power, and so does Theo. Do not be misled by his appearance. He is older than he looks, and far stronger.
Theo took another drink. They sat in silence until several men entered with armloads of things that they dropped on the floor. Another two came in with a trunk that they set down and opened.
This was the best we found,
the man said. He opened the trunk and lifted out the robes of silk that were inside. He draped them over his arm to show Shannon. The others sorted out jewelry and other oddments of personal belongings ranging from a comb set to a fine saddle that was studded with rubies. Shannon nodded. The men stepped out with relief. Theo was feeling better as the drink sank into him. It was helping him to recover from the long magic use, and the headache was sinking away. It also helped that his body was warmed and his feet were thawing out.
You awake, Theo?
Shannon asked in Owens. Theo looked at him and nodded.
I'm awake.
The others have fallen into the river and have entered into elven territory. At best, they will be captured and sold as slaves. Carver will likely be killed, rather horribly, either way. We have to outrun them and try to get in a position to either buy them at auction or pay a reward for them.
Theo knew enough about elves to know that this was a much more complicated plan than what he was saying. With elves, nothing was straightforward. Being accepted by elves was not easy and even harder to do so in a hurry. They were a different species than humans, or Purtons, and they acted a great deal differently on many levels. Theo's mother's hobbies of the dark nature had led her to shadowy friends who were not the normal type. Some of the more acceptable and mild friends she kept were elven merchants. Theo had learned a great deal playing with the sons of those merchants, not all of it good, but he knew how elves acted and what they expected. He knew what was taken as proper behavior and what was not. The problem was that those elves were outside the barrier shield, and the elves here had not been out in so many generations. Things might have changed.
They will never let us in to buy slaves at a market like that.
Elliot said, looking up at Shannon.
And we don't have the time for political games.
If we do not, then the others will die,
Shannon said simply. Theo knew that Shannon was as knowledgeable about the elves as he was, and probably had a good idea about how it might be done. It also meant no pirates, but the pirates were not going to stay out of it if they did not have faith in Shannon's plan. Theo tried to think of how he might get into court. It would not be an easy task, but all he really had to do was get them in deep enough to have a pass into slave markets where someone like Kava might be sold. In another part of the world, Shannon, as a Perton, would have the upper hand. Here he was clearly not native and would stand out. If he tried to even portray that he was at all supposed to be here, they would see through it. How could they hope to get in? How could Theo get in as a lord with the money to buy exotic slaves, and how would he do it with Shannon to watch his back?
And you can't just sneak in and steal them,
Elliot objected.
We have to play the games on their rules.
They have shield spells and wards that I cannot slip,
Shannon said.
I might be able to hide inside your shields,
Shannon said to Theo.
but I might also have to get inventive very quickly.
Theo thought about that, and about the battle he had just seen. He bowed his head, many things fitting together. In a way, he had to thank his mother for being such a horrid, evil woman. She had taught him how to deal with this world rather well, and to recognize the truths in it. Funny, he smiled to himself. All his teachers who had ever been good to him and out to help him had been vampires, and every one of them had been under a great deal of strain. He tried not to think about Garson. The man had been his first friend and a caged pet for his mother. Theo had kept him alive for years by slipping his hand through the bars to let the former wizard, but long-turned vampire, slit Theo's small finger and save his sanity with the blood of a child. Theo had been sent away, and that was the end for Garson. When Theo came back, it was too late, and his mother had Garson's head pickled in a jar in her study. He looked up at Shannon. Garson had been strong, but he would not have been able to deal with Oirion or Ravon's blood, and never a full battle. Shannon had to be fantastically strong. Theo shifted, thinking about that.
How do they control the slaves here?
Theo asked.
Collars, mostly.
Elliot said.
Some have spells laid right on them, but that's pretty rare.
Can you create an illusion with enough strength to not be detected or removed by the elves?
Theo asked Shannon.
No, but Elliot can.
Shannon said.
What do you have in mind?
I can't on Shannon. I've tried, but the spells just don't hold.
Elliot said quickly.
I meant on me. I just need to be tweaked a little to look elven a bit, not fully. Just a bit.
I can do that.
What are you thinking?
Shannon asked Theo.
My mother is friends with Paltinustan. Do you know him?
I do.
Elliot said.
He is an elven black market runner, a smuggler who trades with some very dark characters, black magic items, sacrificial victims, that sort.
He told Shannon.
Who is your mother to know him?
He asked.
He has something like 60 children.
Theo said.
I could fake being one of the lesser ones, say that I am out to win his favor. I can even set it up to possibly get a contact to him, to confirm that we are who we say. I know his roots and passwords well enough.
Elliot looked at Theo as if he had just sprouted wings.
And you can pull that off?
Elliot asked.
You know, my son's soul is on the line with this. How do you get Shannon to fit in? And are you sure you can pull it off?
Shannon gets to play my pet vampire.
Theo said with a shrug.
You can do that, right? Figure out some way to make it look as if I was sort of controlling you. Make you sort of a...
He thought of the word.
Not so much a slave, but more like a summons.
Shannon leaned forward on his knees a bit and looked at Theo, interested, but not sure if he was going to say anything or not.
I could do one better,
Shannon said after a moment of debate with himself.
I could be your pet vampire. I could portray that you have a gremlin of some sort, and that its energy is used to hold control over your trophy. It could be made to seem that he is the one who has the power to support your will and force compliance from your captive.
He offered. Theo smiled.
Now see, that would be something rather worthy of respect, but I would have to be able to discuss it and even repeat it to convince them.
That is some dark magic.
Elliot said cautiously.
Do you think you could convince them of controlling a vampire?
Theo looked at Dave's father a moment.
Well, that would stand to reason, don't you think?
Shannon actually smiled an honest smile.
Good God, help me.
Elliot said.
As if Shannon wasn't enough.
He muttered. Theo looked back to Shannon and saw the smile.
Can you make it so that whatever you pretend to be is something that I can mimic, summon on my own, or at least explain how to do it?
Theo asked carefully.
You think you can drop a control on a vampire?
Shannon asked seriously.
I haven't done it personally, but I know how, and I have seen it done a number of times.
Theo admitted with an uneasy glance toward Elliot. Shannon scowled ever so slightly.
Your mother?
She is an evil woman, Shannon. One day I will kill her, and Pert will be much better off for it.
He said in Elven.
The accent is wrong,
Shannon said.
You sound too pertin. We can work on that.
The more I hear it spoken, the better I will be able to speak it.
Theo shrugged.
But you know how elves are and what sort of things will be expected. I would rather you play the more amusing role and draw their attention away from me. I am not so sure I can play that role very well. If you are a slave, then I can protect you from them at least. I think that if you act as though you wish I wouldn't, you could keep them all looking at you and not at me.
Shannon nodded.
I'm sure that I can manage to get their attention, but they might see that as insulting.
I know, but we can't just run in and do this Ivan style. We have to play it somehow, and I think the only way it can be done is for me to play elf and keep you as close as I possibly can. But money is a problem. We need money to buy slaves.
I have a nice stash.
Elliot said.
Several, actually, that I sort of set up with you in mind.
Elliot told Shannon.
Money is not that much of an issue, and it might be a magic that he can use to impress. You can just sort of fake it for him.
You key me in?
Shannon asked.
To the blood,
Elliot said.
There are several vaults.
The demon magic could play in there.
Shannon mused. He leaned back, his chair creaking.
My major concern right now is if he can pull it off. No offense, kid, but I have met elves, and you do not move or look or breathe elven.
Theo looked over at him.
I need a bath and a horse and clothes, and then we can go,
he said.
Help yourself.
Shannon motioned to the trunks.
The sooner we can get going, the better.
Get our horses ready. I won't take too long,
Theo said. He pushed himself up and began picking through the trunks, choosing several pieces.
Where are we?
Even asked Kava. They huddled together under the weak sun, cold and sore. He did not think that they wanted to be where they were. The river was wide here, with a narrow shoreline of gravel, strewn with dead wood and tangles of brush. Ice lined the water's edge, covered the rocky banks, and floated in bits down the river. The banks were mostly rock that turned to forest at its outer edge.
Pesica.
Kava said.
Sphinx lands are on the other side of the river, and we don't want to be there either, but this is bad. Really bad for me.
Why are sphinxes so bad? Salma liked us,
Dave said.
That's different. She was a nomad. She knew the risks of traveling beyond her own land, and went anyway. There on the other side of the river, if you get caught, they kill you and don't bother to ask questions. Without Salma, it's a very bad idea to be there.
What's wrong with this side?
Even asked.
This is elven territory. They are even more ruthless than the Sphinx. They kill the weak and enslave the rest. No, this is not a good place to be either.
He looked around them.
This is where my people came from. We were hunted beyond the forest by the untouched.
Kava almost snarled at the term used by those who had escaped without any obvious warps.
If we are caught, I will not be treated well.
Do we go back upstream then?
Ravan asked.
Back to the nomads?
No,
Dave said.
But what about Tavia, Travis, and Salma?
Even objected plaintively.
They are safer where they are,
Raven said.
Travis can speak the language, and Tavia is not the sort of woman who will have to settle for a lesser rank in that world. Let her be. She'll fit in there and be happy.
What about Theo and Shannon?
Ivan asked. Dave looked up at that.
that is not our problem right now.
What then?
Oirion pressed.
We need to get this decided so we can move on. If death is the cost of trespassing, we should be on our way.
Where does this river go?
Dave asked Kava.
Even if we reach the coast, there is a shield in the way of escape.
Oirion reminded him.
We passed through it once before.
Even said.
At the church's will.
Ravan said.
You forget that we are the foxes in a hunt here. I wonder if we're still being followed.
He added with an uneasy glance up the river.
Hunted or not, maybe Shannon will rejoin us and can help us deal with the shield,
Dave said.
So we put all our faith in Shannon?
Oirion demanded.
You are going to have to trust me that he will be there, Oirion. Decide now. If you cannot do it, then Carver can go back upriver with you.
And lose my last chance to go home?
That is the price.
Dave shrugged, sounding rather Shannon-like for a moment.
Come on, Oirion,
Ravan said.
You could never stay in these lands, and you know it. Besides, what's to say they won't follow us anyway, and kill us for having seen the things we have seen here? It can't be too hard for them to know who was with Shannon. We might not be the target of the hunt, but we have seen too much, and are enemies to the powers here.
Oirion nodded then, almost reluctantly.
I'll run with you as close to the coast as I dare,
Kava said.
and see you off. I do not think the world beyond the barrier is ready for my face. Hell, most races here are not ready for my face.
He chuckled and shook his head, amused at it on some level.
I can get home on my own and along the way tell Tavia what has happened to you, that you got washed down the river but you're fine.
Let's get dried out and move then,
Ravan said.
Anyone have any food?
Theo was more accustomed to the long silk robes than he was to the furs and belts of the last few months. Dressing up in fine robes was almost comforting somehow, but the robes themselves felt stained. They were not his, but the leftovers from another man's life. The owner had been a man who was a good bit taller than he was, but Theo's chest filled out the top half rather well. Amazing, Theo thought, as he smoothed the silk over the chest he had now. He was far more muscular than he had been when they landed on this continent. Even as bad as things were, he realized that he was in far better shape than he had ever been. He had put on weight in lean muscle. It was an encouraging revelation. He dressed in the robes, noticing they were not normal silk robes. The robes fit him reasonably well, but they weren't exactly elven. There wasn't much he could do to them to improve the look, and as he dressed, he knew that Shannon's clothes were going to be a problem, also. There was no doubt that Shannon's, and possibly his own description, would have been given to the elves, and if they walked into any elven city, Jerome would know. He was just finishing dressing when Shannon entered. Theo stood in the tent, feeling almost like himself, but he had concerns about the plan and the time it would take.
This feels like such a slow way to do this,
He said.
Are you sure we can't just sneak in?
I'm sure.
Shannon said, walking up to him. He looked Theo over critically. Theo had layered on 2 robes and had cut the length across the front and back in alternate sweeps, allowing him to ride a horse and still have his legs covered. He had used magic to seam the fabric, a trick he did often to repair his clothes.
It's not very elven, Shannon, but there is some limit here on choices. I think if we can just get to a city and buy something, then we can just dump all this. I think maybe you need to add something to yourself. I'm sure you're well known in that outfit. Maybe if you traded the surcoat for a robe or something, anything.
He appealed. Shannon nodded.
I know, Theo. I will. I just have to work the fabric. We can do that on the way. I want to show you some of that as we go. We can add to your wardrobe some powers that will make up for the lack of fashion in elven eyes. I'm more concerned that you understand the elven culture enough that you can play a lord.
I understand it well enough. My accent is off a bit, though, and I'm not so sure that I can fake it if it gets to the point that some elf is coming up behind me with romantic plans, but other than that, I should be just fine.
He smoothed the front of the robes and looked at the tall Purton.
We have horses, I hope.
Rather nice ones, as well as several pack horses loaded with your new things.
Are we bringing Tavia and Salma?
No. Salma's people are in territorial rivalry with the elves. It would be an insult to all involved to bring Sphinx into elven territory. And Tavia is far safer and better off here. Her goal has always been to keep Travis safe, and now she can.
She won't like that, Shannon.
I know, but she will be alive to be angry about it. She is respected, and they want her to stay as a sort of wise woman. Mother Ruler of Kings is the translation.
He gestured.
The role will suit her. We have to go, and cannot be slowed by extras.
Theo didn't like it, but he understood it. He nodded.
Are we ready then?
One more stop. You have to be spelled, and then you have to show the crew of the ship that you can do this. They are all friends and uncles of David and want to go to war to get him back. They have to stay out of this. First, I have to do your hair.
After they had dried out, they began to hike down the river in a single file, moving as fast as they could. The forest seemed to be a young growth, dense and wild, and the shore was rocky. They all cursed the sound they made clattering down the shore, but the forest was too thick to move in. They all knew it would be death to be found too far from the river. They needed to move quickly, noise or not. They had traveled most of the day when suddenly Raven stepped into a run and vanished in a race down the river. The rest looked at each other and followed. They stumbled upon him a short distance along, kneeling over someone, holding icy cold hands and blowing on them.
Saints' graves.
Even swore as he scrambled toward Raven. They had found Kelly. She was half frozen, her lips blue and her face white. Ice had formed on her hair where she was breathing on it, and blood was frozen in her clothes. She had been shot by the arrow that was lying next to her. It was neither nomad nor church in design.
Elf!
Kava swore. He knelt, took one of Kelly's boots off and began rubbing her white foot. Oirion took the other and began the same treatment. He also built a tent as he worked and raised it around the nearly dead woman. Kelly opened her eyes slowly and focused on Dave.
I can't be dead. Too much pain.
Miss us?
Dave asked with a worried smile.
I was wondering if you were going to show up.
She smiled tightly as the shivering started. The men all crowded in and pushed their bodies up against her to help her warm up. Only when she was warm enough that the shivering had slowed did they let her have some room. Orion's tent was holding in both the heat of bodies and energy, offering them all relief that they would not have had any other way. Once she seemed stable enough to risk open bleeding, Raven lifted her tunic to the wound in her side.
It's not bad,
he said, then applied some magic to seal it up as best he could.
Can you get up?
It was an ugly wound, but with the magic that he used, it was sealed, and she would not risk more blood loss. It would hurt and likely scar her for the rest of her life, but she was alive. She pushed herself up, but accepted Dave's anxious hand. On her feet, she winced a little and nodded.
I think the more I move, the better I feel. Shannon here?
No, he saw us go in, though, so I expect he'll find us.
Raven said.
Tavier?
She's warm and comfortable with the nomads,
Oirion said. Using Dave as a balance, Kelly followed Kava as he began to pick their path away from where she had been shot. It was shortly after they had begun to move that Raven went ahead, motioning them to stay still. He returned with a smile.
Elves,
he whispered.
They have several boats along the far shore. If one of us could swim over, we might get in a boat and be out of here quickly.
What side is Elven?
Oirion asked with a hint of distress. He suddenly felt lost, and as if the very direction of the sun's path had been altered.
They should not be on that side of the river.
Who cares what they are doing?
Raven breathed.
Here, there, it's no matter. They will kill us either way.
I'll meet you downriver,
Dave said, ignoring them both. He went at once into the river, lowered himself quietly, and went under, vanishing. They went wide, crawling up the bank to the forest, to be well clear of the elves. It was far warmer under the trees, but the snow was deep and held tracks that any could see for some time. Raven carefully led them some distance past the elven encampment on the far shore. It took time to crawl through the trees and thick brush, but they had no choice. Once around a bend out of sight of the elven patrol, they helped each other down to the shore as quietly as possible. They crouched behind dead wood on the gravel wash line and waited. It wasn't too long before two boats appeared from around the bend. Ivan moved out into the water to catch them. Dave held on to the side of one. The boats were about 10 feet long, narrow and slender, and stocked with paddles and packs. They got in as fast as they could. Ivan and Kava went in first at Dave's direction, each in separate boats. Oirion and Raven joined Ivan, while Dave and Kelly crawled in with Kava. Kava shook his head.
I don't like it. It's tipsy.
He said very nervously.
You'll get used to it,
Dave said, as he took a paddle in the stern.
Won't they miss the boats?
Oirion asked.
They will, but they won't be able to follow us.
Dave said.
Why?
Ivan asked.
I let the other boats go as well.
He looked back just as the other boats began to appear, drifting on the current, but moving with a good enough clip to be gaining on them.
Time to paddle, let's be gone quickly.
Here we go again,
Oirion muttered, as they all took up paddles, fleeing in boats on unknown waters. Even as he dug into the water with his paddle, he again raised the wizard magic of a tent to hold warmth inside the boat. The bit of water that they had all been in was painful. He wished he could cast it on the other boat as well, but couldn't. The best he could do was whisper a prayer for Dave, who was dripping head to toe.
How do you do that?
Raven asked.
It's an inverted shield of a sort. I don't know how to explain it. Jamie made it.
It's all right,
Dave said, shivering.
The less magic we use, the better. Orion's shield isn't leaving much of a mark, but trying to figure it out might.
You're going to freeze to death,
Kava said.
No.
Dave grinned through his new beard, which was rather dark against his white face.
I've been in colder waters before.
That doesn't change things much,
Raven said.
I also have been in colder waters, but it's damn cold out here in the wind. We might be out here for days. Not even a pertinent wizard would be all right with that.
I'll be all right. Let's just get out of here,
Dave said, with a serious look to the dwarf. Raven didn't like it, but grunted and dug his paddle into the cold water. Dave was right. Either he'd be all right or he wouldn't, and they had to get out of the area as quickly as possible. Theo was almost warm as they took off on the horses. The sun was coming up behind dense clouds that rolled with thunder. Lightning flickered through it at times, just enough to make the horses uneasy. The battle had gone on for miles, with strewn-out corpses of men and horses as proof of the epic event. The reek of magic and burnt battlefield was all that Theo could smell. He knew it would permeate the two of them, with both the smoke and the magic in every bit of fabric. To pull this off, he would have to purify it all and find some sort of perfume. His mind was reviewing every detail as he rode on. Then he noticed Shannon. The Pertin kept pushing for speed to get clear of the battlefield, to get out of sight of all of it. His skin was looking terribly white, even in the faint light of the day. Theo worried that Shannon's shields were down, and the blood of the battle was getting to him. The magics in the air had to be insanely difficult for him to deal with. Theo's thoughts on how to pull off the elven game were traded for the reality of whom he was traveling with.
Can I help?
Theo asked.
Just keep moving,
Shannon said. Theo nodded and kept going. They finally left the battlefield and traveled down a steep draw into a forest. It was full of large thorned shrubs that reminded Theo of roses, but with broad leaves and clusters of small dead flowers. Very green vines with glossy star-shaped leaves grew along the bank of a narrow stream. Shannon almost fell off his horse, stumbled for the water, and dropped to his knees. Theo reined in his edgy horse as Shannon convulsed into dry heaves. He wanted to help, to offer support, but suspected that any involvement would be unwanted. The fact that he was even witness to it was likely a hard thing for Shannon. The man did not show weakness, and here he was on his knees, sick to his stomach. Theo dismounted to catch Shannon's horse and guided the two mounts a short distance away. He tried not to look at his comrade. It was almost impossible not to feel sick over the obvious pain Shannon was in. Shannon was in need, and his entire body trembled with it. It was all he could do to hold himself up. The energies that sustained the living flesh of the man had run too low, and the vampire was being pushed dangerously close to loss of self-control. Theo clenched his teeth and put his back to Shannon, trying to focus on the horses as Shannon sobbed for relief. Theo had been forced to watch vampires be drained and knew how ugly and painful such a process was. Conversations spun through Theo's mind. The truth of who Shannon was hit him again, leaving him further at war with himself over what to do. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but Shannon was one for self-control, and this had to be terrible for the man to go through. Theo turned to ask what he might do, in time to see Shannon spit blood into the stream. In his black-gloved hand, Shannon scooped up a little water to sip at. His hand shook so badly that the hand was little more than damp by the time it reached his lips. Theo dug in the pack to find a cup to bring to him. Without asking, without allowing Shannon to deny the help, Theo knelt at the stream and filled the small golden cup that the pirates had put in the pack. Full of clean, fresh water, he offered it to Shannon. Still choking on dry heaves, Shannon almost ignored the offering, but after a moment he took it. Funny, Theo thought, here he was, offering the Prince of Pert a sip of spring water from a golden cup. There had to be some grand significance to it. The heir to the throne of Awans kneeling in the mud with the heir to the empire did not happen often, he was sure. Shannon held the little cup as if it would steady his hands. Theo was in no rush. He was upset about the situation, but oddly honored to be there. No falsehood of who they were, just the two of them kneeling in the mud. He expected it to last until Shannon got up. He expected it to never be mentioned. Shannon wiped his mouth on his cuff and sat back on his heels.
God, if I could just die.
He let out his breath, his head falling forward. Theo got up, brushed off his knees, and offered his hand to Shannon. He thought it silly once he realized he'd done it. Shannon was not one to respond to such gestures. Shannon, however, did take his hand to get up. Clearly exhausted, his eyes bloodshot and his face terribly white, Shannon moved to get his horse. The animal was jumpy by now and did not want to be taken, but Shannon whispered a word, settling the animal at once. He took a moment to summon enough energy to mount. Theo said nothing as he followed suit and moved to catch up the lead ropes of the other horses.
We should get clear of the area,
Shannon said softly. Theo didn't argue. It was time to be moving on. His nerves were feeling uneasy, and that was never a good sign. The last time he had felt the hair on the back of his neck start to rise, it had turned out to be a very, very bad day. They covered a great distance being on horses, even with the pack horses in tow. Shannon was quiet, even for him. Camp was odd that evening with just the two of them. Theo found himself fumbling with the effort to make a fire and cook for them. Shannon didn't eat anything but bread and a little tea, all for the better, as Theo burned most of what he cooked. Shannon didn't seem to notice as he set up the tent for Theo. They shifted their actions to fit the roles they were forced to play. Theo was uneasy doing less and less, making Shannon do more and more. It felt very backwards and wrong. He stayed his hands from help with the thought of what the elves would do to his friends if they got a hold of them. He and Shannon had to hurry and not get caught. As they continued downstream, the riverbanks became rough. The stone changed from smooth, river-rounded gravel to ancient lava flows of hard and jagged stone, cracked only with the massive roots of the towering trees. The ground rose and fell, with sudden cliff-faced gorges through which the river roared. Shannon and Theo had to either creep along or go around them. Sometimes the ground about them would suddenly open and become gentle and distractingly pretty. Shannon watched the world about them with a great deal of caution, informing Theo that the trees hid a lot. Theo tried not to notice the half-eaten dead bodies that had washed up on the banks. At least the cold kept them from stinking too bad. It was several days before they caught sign of the others. Shannon knelt to study the rocks on the shore. He rose, not looking so happy.
We find them?
Theo asked.
We found them, but we aren't alone.
Shannon pointed to a track that could be easily overlooked on the edge of the little camp where the gravel met grass.
You can see Ivan's track here.
He outlined it.
And here, how it is half pressed down on this side. Look at it with sight, and then look back that way, trace it, study the area for it. Here, touch it if you need to.
Theo knelt and put his fingers on the spot that Shannon had pointed to. He rose up the sight that he rarely used, studied the energy at his fingers, and then he looked in the direction that Shannon had pointed. He didn't see them very well. It was almost as if they had been washed out, but there was a single line of tracks that came from the trees, and to this point. As he let his eyes look over the whole camp, he saw that there was more than one line of tracks, and they went all over. Shannon put a hand on Theo's shoulder, and all at once Theo saw blurred, transparent images of elves in gray and white uniforms moving through the camp. He also saw images of the others. He could see Even and Revan, Oirion, Kava, and Kelly as well.
Wow,
He said, as the past became visible to him.
how did you do that?
Shannon knelt beside Theo in an oddly intimate closeness. He pointed across the camp toward an image of Revan, kneeling over a point in the dirt and snow, doing something.
Revan left us an energy trail, and he left it activated in such a way that the elves would not sense it. He recorded it for us, so that we would know where they went. He is a rather gifted cleric. It is a pity that the Church has denied him true power.
He rose and drew Theo up with him.
Any other elf to come along now would see what we can see, so now we clear it off so that no one else can see it. It's an old cleric's trick I didn't know he knew about at all, but then, why not? All of you surprise me at every turn.
He sighed and stood a moment, looking at Theo, but his mind clearly elsewhere.
Clear it, Theo,
Shannon said when he came back to himself. Theo looked up at the man who was so close to him. It was really rather odd, as Shannon never stood close to anyone. He turned his attention to the energy marks left in the air and considered how best to deal with them. He knew various magics to do it, but nothing that, in turn, would not be felt and seen. He looked back up at the tall man.
How do I do that and not leave my own mark?
If you must leave a mark, make it look like it is someone else's. Impress me, Theo,
he said. Theo almost rolled his eyes and muttered, but didn't. He thought about it and shifted uneasily at the solution to the problem.
It is just you and I here. There is no priest to make a fuss. Do what has to be done,
Shannon instructed.
Can't you just do something?
No, I am afraid that I am going to be able to do very little without setting off a great deal of alarms. Do whatever you have to, Theo.
Theo looked up at him again, then went to his pack and dug for what he hoped was there. He found a stone that was smaller than he would have liked, but it would be of use. It was set as a pendant on a gold chain, but he figured Shannon could change that if he needed to. Taking a deep breath and calming himself, he began the slow work of drawing energy into the stone, using it like an eraser to clean the images away. He started with the spell that Revan had left. It was slow and would take the rest of the day, but he stayed to it. If there was a better way to do it, then he was sure that Shannon would say something. Each time the stone filled with energy, he knelt, laid it on the ground, and channeled the power out of it cleanly into the earth. Then he started all over again. He had to drain it no less than 12 times. The last time, he filled it as full as he could get it. Once the stone was on the verge of cracking with the power it held, he offered it to Shannon.
Maybe you should keep this.
Shannon took it in his hand and looked at it a moment. He nodded a little.
We should move on. There is a road not far from here.
Theo nodded. He was tired, but an elven lord would not camp on the riverbank with a road so nearby. It was not a high-traffic road, a patrol route more than anything. They would have a hard time explaining what they were doing out here if they were found, so they were careful and stayed alert for other travelers. It was late that afternoon when Shannon moved them off the road quickly. Dismounting, they kept their horses quiet, calming them with soft talk as a patrol charged past them, heading north at a wild pace. The horses ridden by the patrol were sweat-covered and foaming at the mouths. Shannon stood a moment, watching the way they had gone.
They looking for someone?
I don't think so,
Shannon said.
I cannot tell for certain, but something is distracting them. They could have come to see what might have crossed the border. Every wizard with any skill inside the shield will be feeling the aftershocks of that battle.
Well, if they are distracted, it's good for us, I suppose. We should put on some speed to get clear of whatever it is.
Shannon was already on the move. It was nearly dark when they crossed the river, using a fine, arched wooden bridge. Once dismounted, Shannon went to the river and stood at the water's edge, watching it without moving. Theo let him be and moved to set up camp. They needed to rest as much as the horses did. He saw to the horses, brushing them down and whispering to them in Elder Awans, the language of the sorcerers of Pert before the Great War. It was a language that one does not learn, but is given. The language was a gift from a fairy that his mother had trapped in her study. When he had released the fairy from her prison, the little thing was so happy that she gave Theo everything his mother had sought. There were more trinkets of power that she had given, but Theo never played with the rest. He liked the sound of the language, so he used it. Mostly, he used it to whisper to animals, as they seemed to respond well to it. The horses soaked up the attention, and he let them go untied to eat at whatever they could find while he pulled out what grain they had. This was not the work of a lord, and he fumbled a bit in it, but he enjoyed the task and was satisfied when the horses were seen to, and eating at the nosebags with a contented focus. He looked for wood, but what he found was wet. Looking at it, he sighed. There was simply no way that he was going to be able to light a fire with the little tools Tavia used. He muttered the spell and pointed. Fire roared up a moment, then died down and settled on the chunks of wood. He had never had the chance to use his power freely, and was still learning the force with which to execute things. He was getting better, but he was still sloppy, which annoyed him a bit. The magics of the world were not what he was good at. What magic he did know, he had never used in force, but rather held it all in check and denial, reining it in, denying his true strength. Spreading the tarp out, Theo settled with his cloak pulled up about him. He dug into his robes to pull out his journal. There was nowhere to hide such a thing except between realms, and it was from there that he pulled it. He glanced up to see if Shannon had felt him use the magic of a vault, but Shannon was preoccupied and paid him no attention. Theo sat back and began sketching Shannon at the river's edge. The little book was all he had left from the trip so far. Locked in its pages, and under illusions of very bad poetry, were sketches he had drawn of 1,000 things, from dreams to people. He figured it would be a good skill to pick back up and a good way to work on magics. He took his time to strengthen the lock spells and work on the illusion. It was getting dark when Shannon left the river and came over to the camp. Theo had set out a cup of tea for him, as Tavia did, and motioned to the cup. He had already had 2 cups of hot tea and watched as the Purton took the cold tea.
They passed here a few days ago. 2, maybe,
Shannon said after he sat down and took a sip.
They are in boats. That makes it harder for us, but better for them.
You hide their trail?
Theo asked, wondering what had kept Shannon so preoccupied. Shannon looked up from the little cup he held in both hands.
As far as I could reach.
They sat in silence as darkness fell. Theo looked back to his book and sketched until it was too dark to see. A lot of things were going through his mind, from the magics of the nomads to the life he had left behind. He shivered as memories of things tried to creep up at him. He had worked so hard to escape being Therodon lords, and yet here he was, being pushed, step by step, back to it by none other than Tyrardel von Armand. Theo looked up at Shannon. The man sat, as always, back from the fire. Truly, it was him, or what was left of him. Theo had to remind himself repeatedly that Shannon was not the priest that the Prince of Pert had once been. Theo had been drug into hell, forced to learn at the feet of a demon, and had seen and felt the heat of the hellfire. Thinking of being cast into those flames was nearly impossible. He felt sickened, suffocating on a tidal wave of emotions, all of it threatening to choke him. He shivered and felt the defiling stain that was part of his body, to the point that he could not stand his own flesh. He shrank within himself, wanting to curl up and be rid of it all. There was nothing strong or great about him. He should not know who he sat with. He should not be here. And lives should not be resting on his ability to pretend to be an elf. Theo wanted to run away, to throw up, to cry. He drove up more shields, refusing to admit that the things of his nightmares were real. They were real, though, from what he had been forced to be part of to what he was at his very core. Thunder rolled to the north just before a hot wind swirled through the camp.
You wear shields, Theo,
Shannon said softly, not opening his eyes or shifting from his trance. Theo looked up. Shields? Yes, he wore shields. He had to hide his secrets and the stain of his very birth.
I'm not a wizard,
he said, his voice cracking. It had not done that in weeks, and he flinched at it.
I did not say you were a wizard.
Shannon opened his eyes.
I said you wear shields. Only in the reaction of the energy from the battle can I even see them. If you did not put them on yourself, then who did?
Theo wrung his hands together, recalling the set of events that led to it all. The bones in his hands ached. The joints could feel the pressure. He jerked his mind from the memories.
I don't want to talk about it,
he said weakly.
I can see that,
Shannon said.
You know, I will be going into very dangerous territory and will most likely have to hide in your shadow. I was not counting on shields to get in the way.
Shannon was right, of course. This whole thing was insane. They were all but walking into Jerome's hands, but why? For the lives of those few of their company who had been swept away?
Tell me why it matters so much. Your freedom is worth more than a handful of souls.
Theo looked up.
Why do you risk it?
Shannon didn't answer at once. It was a fair question, though, and if Theo was going to talk, he needed no less back.
David is my cousin. The line is carried in him. It is possible that he could assume the throne.
That took a moment to sink in. He had to admit that after seeing Dave in the sanctuary, a part of him had dared to hope such might be true, but to be so closely related to Shannon was impressive nonetheless.
Not his father?
No, his father's cores were too badly damaged in a fight. The thin line of possibility for him has passed, and he cannot pass it on again. Even if Elliot has another child, that child will not inherit the power of the family line. David is the last. If he is discovered, it will be very bad for him and for the world.
All right, so we're going after Dave. Why the others? Why did you stay at all?
At first I asked that same question, many times a day. Consider it yourself. They ask why I would defend your right to use magic. Why would I?
I am in the line of kings,
Theo asked, not sure.
So is Oirion.
Is that why you put up with him?
No.
Shannon half smiled.
Oirion is far more than just a bloodline, just as you are far more than your name as well.
There is no one in the group that you would leave to Jerome, is there?
No. I would sooner kill them, to spare them, than to allow them to be tortured, and Theo, I think each on their own, would be a prize in his hands. Now, about your shields.
Theo knew he had to tell, but it took him a moment to put it all together.
My mother is obsessed with dark magics. From her blood-bought youth to her delight in the rape of the bodies and souls of others, she has had great study. I was supposed to be her trophy, her prize pupil.
He wrung his hands.
My very conception was a product of black magic and rape.
He felt sickened just talking about it. He shook his head and then went on.
She had a creature trapped in an orb. I don't know if it was a soul orb or an elemental or what it was, but I released it. She almost caught me in the act. It hid within me. My mother was so close.
He flinched from the memory of her rage.
To hide itself, it put up shields. I said I just wanted to look at it. I was punished, but maintained that I just wanted to look and that it had escaped my hands when she startled me. When I woke, it rewarded me for not giving it up by making the shields permanent, that's all I know. I don't even know what realm. They have held up to archdemons and prying blood magics. On the outside, I seem to be nothing but a normal man, utterly devoid of power.
Only a dragon can do that,
Shannon said softly.
It is how they hide.
Theo looked up.
Well then, you know more than I do.
There are many types of dragons, Theo. None of them dwell in orbs, unless it is a soul stone of one that has been ripped from his body by a necromancer.
Theo nodded, trying not to shiver.
I would not be surprised.
Shannon was still for a while. Theo tried to shake the discomfort and fear he always felt with talking of any sort of magic that he had known, or might yet be asked to perform in this place. When Shannon spoke, he nearly jumped.
When a vampire is made, the sheer power of the transformation destroys the person on levels beyond the physical. When that happens, one of the effects is that his teeth shatter. They explode. The power manifests into the fangs that men paint on the images of vampires. Every time he goes into madness, and that energy steals him back, he loses his mind, and his soul is ripped apart as horrifically as the first time. Beware the crazy, old toothless man. He may be more than he seems.
You have teeth.
Theo said.
Perfect teeth.
Shannon said with a faint smile.
Dragon bone. Nothing else will endure the magics I deal with. Teeth, bone, even stone shatters. Dragons are not easy to deal with. I know the levels of magic that they are part of. For one to be able to hide within you, at any age, is impressive. For one to do so and leave you sane, and to further honor you with such a shield, is almost unheard of.
I was a child, Shannon.
Theo said.
I don't know, I don't care. The shield hid me from my mother until she gave up and thought of me as a weak disappointment and a slap to her pride. I am nothing to her but another toy that she delights in inflicting pain upon. She will neither miss me nor look for me. She will likely have another son and make him heir. All the better in her mind.
I wish Raven was here,
Shannon said softly.
Why?
He would know more about dragons, familiars, and summons than I do. I deal more with demons than totems,
he said with a bit of bitterness to his tone.
Familiars stay, summons are reachable. He left, simply giving me the gift of the shield on the way.
Perhaps, but if you have a dragon summons, getting into the elven court will be far easier.
If I had one, he would be in my sanctuary,
Theo said, without thinking. He caught himself too late and actually slapped his hand over his mouth. He had gone through hell and not revealed that secret, and just now he did it. He had just blurted it out. Shannon's look was clearly one of shock.
Sanctuary?
He asked carefully. Theo squirmed.
Theo?
Shannon pressed.
Oh, please, Shannon, don't make me think about these things. I don't want to.
Theo was almost on the verge of tears.
Why?
Shannon asked, after a long moment of silence. Silent except for Theo, trying not to cry, and the sound of thunder growing closer. Theo noticed that Shannon had waited until he had self-control again. He looked up at the man.
The same reason that I would not think to ask you to tell me about your children,
he said softly.
I have no reason to fight anymore. I don't have to be in torment. I can run away. I am still mortal. Why would I want to deal with it? Why would I want to admit any of it? Why would I risk it? The events that were the catalyst were horrid, and I do not want to talk about it. Can I not just be left alone about it all?
Theo shifted, wanting to run away, but he looked back to the man who still watched him.
Didn't you know when I showed Dave?
Shannon lifted an eyebrow at him.
You showed David about sanctuary energy, or something else? What exactly did you show him, Theo?
I don't want to talk about it.
Theo looked away, knowing if he admitted what he had done, a measure of his true power would be exposed, and Shannon would never allow him to deny it again. Wind gusted through the little camp, desert hot, almost putting the fire out. A few spatters of hot rain fell before it was still again.
Do you think me evil?
Shannon asked.
No.
Then you must think that it is motive, not magic, that defines evil.
Well, yes.
Do you question your own heart so much that you would think your magic evil? You would put upon yourself something that you would not even put on me.
There is a difference,
Theo said.
Your magics were inflicted, mine were gained in moments of surrender.
All men can be broken,
Shannon said seriously.
All it takes is one split moment. No child should believe, even for a moment, that those types of dark magics forced upon him could possibly be an act of free will, certainly less at the hands of his own mother. You have what you have. Do what you will with it, Theradon, but if you have the power to fight Jerome, and you choose not to, then you have chosen to allow him to carry on as he does.
Theo let the storm gust and swirl bits of forest litter about them before he tried to talk. As he did, he wrestled with what he was going to say. He did not want Shannon, Crown Prince of Pert, to think that he was just shrinking from a spanking.
In refusing my magic, I protect it from being used by her when she gets her hands on me. I cannot beat her. She is a vile soul, as evil as you are not. Say what you want, Shannon. Beyond the grief, beyond your pain, you are still a saint.
And you are King of Aewons, Theradon Lords,
Shannon said softly.
No, Shannon, I'm nothing but a cowardly fool running from my mean mommy like any spoiled brat. I know who you are, and I've always known and yet said nothing, have not defended you, nor even told Oirion to hold his tongue. I'm no king, maybe Pert knows you still and maybe your words hold power, but I am unworthy of this conversation and of any respect or hope you might hold for me.
No, Theo,
Shannon said with a slight shake of his head.
you are more worthy than any king I have met in thousands of years. You dare to give me hope. Get some sleep if you can. The night will get stormy, and tomorrow will be worse.
Thanks for listening, and please like and subscribe to our channel. It helps more than you know.